Welcome back to Illinois Lawmakers' weekly coverage of the spring session of the Illinois General Assembly. I'm Jak Tichenor, along with my Capital News Illinois colleagues, Ben Szalinski, Peter Hancock, and Molly Stevens, who also works with ProPublica and is an assistant professor of journalism at the SIU Carbondale School of Journalism. The House and Senate have been off the past few days for the Easter Passover break. So this week, we're devoting the program to a reporter's roundtable, a good chance for us to sit down and sort of catch up on where the spring session is heading. Ben, I'm going to start with you. We're starting outside this Statehouse actually to kick off the program. A lot of speculation as to whether Illinois senior U.S. Senator Dick Durbin is going to announce whether he's running for re-election, but it didn't happen this week. He was in his hometown of East St. Louis on Monday, and despite earlier speculation that Durbin might decide this week to coincide with the 2026 pre-slating process in Cook County, Durbin said on Monday that has no influence on his decision. So a lot of people, though, wanting to know what Dick Durbin's future is.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a number of top Illinois Democrats who've been very obviously lining up to try and take his seat if he runs. Dick Durbin actually in Springfield on Tuesday said just as much. He said he has been approached privately by some Democrats who have expressed interest in running for Senate someday when his seat would open up. We know that Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton is certainly interested. Representative Lauren Underwood conducted a pretty obvious poll that shows that she might be a leading candidate for this seat. And Representative Raja Krishnamurthy from the Northwest suburbs is one of the top fundraisers in Congress. So that's clearly an indication that he probably has his sights set on a higher office as well.
We also have some others who may be interested, although we did hear earlier that Attorney General Kwame Rule has squelched any speculation that he might be interested in stepping away from the top law enforcement job.
Yeah, he very clearly ruled it out at a City Club of Chicago address a few weeks ago. He said he has no interest in going to Washington. He ruled out essentially running for mayor of Chicago as well. He said he believes he can make a bigger difference in the state of Illinois fighting back against the Trump administration, for example, as an attorney general. He feels that's a more fruitful position for him rather than going to Congress, which we often see as kind of an echo chamber of just back and forth on arguing sometimes.
Um, Senator Durbin said in Springfield on Tuesday that we have a strong Democratic bench with some of the folks that you've been talking about. Peter, I'm curious, as we watch this, someone who hasn't said anything at this point, and obviously there's a reason why he hasn't up to now, is Governor J.B. Pritzker, because he is one of the top Democratic power brokers in the state of Illinois. Any thoughts on what he might say or eventually have to weigh in on the selection process?
Well, at some point, he's going to have to make an announcement about whether or not he wants to run for a third term as governor in 2026, or if he wants to sit out and run for president or some national office in 2028. He may, in fact, do both. He could run for a third term and then in the middle of that term, run for president. So, everybody is kind of waiting to hear what everybody else is going to do. And that it has a domino effect all throughout the Statehouse. If Governor Pritzker wants to move on, then that opens up his office. If Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton wants to run for Senate, that opens up her office. And then, we have a lot of ambitious people here in the Statehouse, a lot of people who've made politics their career. And, Dick Durbin has been sitting on that U.S. Senate seat now for close to 3 decades, and a lot of people are waiting to step up. It sort of reminds me of when Jesse White, sat in the Secretary of State's office for so long. I asked somebody over there one time, aren't there any other Illinois Democrats who want to, step up and maybe run for Secretary of State? And he said, oh, only about 150 of them. So, and I think it's the same way, when you're looking at Pritzker and Stratton and, the members of the U.S. House who might want to move up to the U.S. Senate. It could have a chain reaction up and down Illinois politics.
Oh, no doubt about that. And Molly, I'm curious from your vantage point in Southern Illinois, prior to Dick Durbin holding the seat, that seat was held by former U.S. Senator Paul Simon for 2 terms. All of the names we've mentioned so far are from Chicago or the Chicagoland area. What are Southern Illinois Democrats, and for that matter, I guess Republicans as well, or independents, looking at in terms of this race? Because the center of the population's in the northeastern part of the state, but they are going to have to represent uh, the rest of the state of Illinois border to border.
That's right, Jack. I mean, I think the days where this is a little bit pessimistic of me, but the days where someone from Southern Illinois can be elected to a position like that statewide may be past us for a lot of different reasons, geographically, politically, population-wise. Like you said, Paul Simon had held that at one time, but that has been quite a number of years ago, and we don't see a lot of downstate folks being able to get that name recognition and ID. Like they maybe stood a chance to at one time. But obviously, Democrats here, like you said, Republicans and independents too, want to make sure that whoever they are electing represents the whole state and has them in mind. So I do think we'll see a lot of folks get involved in terms of wanting to make sure that if they're not putting up a candidate, and sometimes they do, right? We do see downstate candidates run. They don't have a great chance of winning often. But I think that folks are going to be very much involved in the process.
I want to go back to Springfield now. As the legislature sort of catches its breath here, we're getting ready to go in the home stretch, the last 6 weeks of the session. Ben, Peter, what's the mood around the Statehouse? We've seen bills moving back and forth between the chambers, but in a lot of respects, it's been kind of quiet.
I would say the mood has been kind of pensive. We just went through deadline week. It's the week where each chamber has to pass most of its non-budget bills and send them across the rotunda to the other chamber. And what we saw, I think, was a lot of the low-hanging fruit, bills that passed by unanimous margins. Only a handful of bills that broke along partisan lines. So I think the real controversial stuff will be coming toward the end of the session in May, along with the budget. But we did see some significant legislation. There were some bills protecting access to abortion and abortion medication. There were some gun-related bills about safe storage requirements, some of the perennial issues that you see in any legislative session, along with just a lot of run-of-the-mill bills about wills and trusts and technical statutory changes that most people would never really notice on a day-to-day basis. But I think we're still kind of waiting for them to get seriously into budget questions and revenue questions, and then some of the more controversial policy questions.
Ben, I'd like for you to jump in.
Yeah, I think the best way to describe it is anxiety is kind of approaching lawmakers here. There's 6, 7 weeks left in the session, and all these big issues are hanging out there, from the budget issues, the uncertainty over federal issues. Public transportation is still a huge outlier. I think, what we saw over the last few weeks was a lot of the general business of the state legislature, the day-to-day stuff, as Peter had mentioned. And, lawmakers are pretty comfortable in that arena, I think, but now the hard choices have to be made. They're going to have to take some very hard votes in the coming weeks that could possibly impact some people's political future. And I think there's just a lot of concern that there's going to be internal strife, especially among Democrats, that could threaten to upend things and make for a very long last few weeks of session.
Is there a particular bill that may cause them some political fallout that you're thinking of?
I think the budget is probably the biggest one, because last year we saw some Democrats actually voted against the budget. And so we already know that there is disagreement over the future of state spending. How much should the state be spending? How much should the state be tapping in other revenue sources? And those challenges have really only gotten worse in the last few years, especially in the last few months, under the Trump administration, where I think, a lot of Democrats are worried that the state is going to lose money, but people, especially in moderate districts who run a risk of losing re-election if they vote for a tax increase or don't do something that their constituents favor, these are the hardest choices for them because it's hard to vote against a budget, but at the same time, it's also hard to vote for something that they feel like could negatively impact their district as well.
It's really interesting that you bring that up because one of the things that people are extremely concerned about, actually on both sides of the aisle, is whether Washington, the Trump administration, will move forward with cuts to Medicaid, and it's one of the largest parts of the Illinois state budget. There's something like 700,000 people covered by the Medicaid extension. And if a lot of this money goes away, then that's in danger. I did talk to one of the top Democratic budget writers last week, and I said, "Well, if that goes away, are we looking at a tax increase?" And he said, "No, nothing like that's on the table at this point." But as you said, Ben, that is something that obviously we'll be keeping an eye on.
Right. And the challenge here for the state is that it can't fill Medicaid going away. That's way too much money. The state would never be able to come up with that much money, even if there is a tax increase in place. It would have to be just so enormous that the people of Illinois probably couldn't stomach it. So I think that's kind of just one of the issues where lawmakers realize that there's hard choices to make out there. They are going to want to fill gaps that the federal government is leaving behind for the state, but some of these gaps are just so big there may not really be a significant role for the state to play. And, that leads to sometimes political consequences because people are going to look to the Democrat Party and the state of Illinois to kind of, be a response to the Trump administration.
We were talking about controversial issues before the lawmakers move toward adjournment. And one of the big ones is having to do with stricter guidelines for homeschooling in the state. This has its root in reporting by Molly Parker and Beth Hunsdorfer of ProPublica and CNI. Molly, give us some of the background on how this Illinois has not historically done much in the way of regulating homeschooling.
That's right. Last summer, Beth Hunsdorfer and I wrote an article, a pretty extensive investigation into Illinois' homeschool laws, and found that Illinois has some of the loosest restrictions on homeschooling in the nation. One of 11 states that really have no rules at all, no requirement that you let any government agency know. No, you don't have to declare that you're homeschooling. Teacher, parents who are teaching or others don't have to have a GED or high school diploma. There's no testing requirements, no attendance requirements, no curriculum requirements, no really anything, and no mechanism, importantly, if someone is facing claims of inadequate schooling, or even if it started as a truancy case where the child actually just stopped going to school and truancy's knocking on the door and parents don't want to get involved in that system, which can lead to court actions. They can say, I'm homeschooling, and whether or not they are, it really just shuts down any kind of investigation into the home.
So fast forward, one of the state representatives on the Democratic side of the aisle, Representative Tara Costa Howard, has framed legislation that would put some new stipulations in effect. What is she trying to do?
After our story came out, she told us that she did plan to study this issue and likely introduce legislation, and she followed through with that this session. The legislation would put Illinois really about middle of the road in terms of regulations. It would require, first off, that families file an intent to homeschool with their regional office of education, just letting folks know, look, we are homeschooling. We're not truant. We're not supposed to be in school. And then the other thing it does that's really important is that it would allow a portfolio review if a child was in a truancy case. So if there's a truancy investigation, that's very important. It's not just at random, it's not a random inspection, and it's not required to show this annually like in some states. But if there was a concern called in, or if it started as a truancy case in the school and there were concerns that the education was inadequate, they could ask to see portfolio, which is really just like there's nothing prescriptive about what has to be in it, but it could be worksheets, lesson plans, curriculum. Although it doesn't say exactly what you have to be teaching in terms of, what the curriculum would look like, just showing that you have some proof of that your children are being educated, which is required by law.
And there's been just an enormous amount of interest in this. I think in reading some of your material, something like more than 40,000 witness slips have been filed on this legislation on all sides, possibly the most that we've seen in probably well over a decade. What's the opposition? What's the pro side on this?
Yeah, the homeschool organizations, particularly the Illinois Christian Homeschool Association and the HSLDA at the national level, have been very opposed to this legislation. And they, especially HSLDA, work across the country and oppose any legislation that would add new restrictions on homeschooling of any type. And they have been particularly fired up in Illinois. Their base is very motivated. These are homeschool families. But some of what we hear them saying is that this would end homeschooling as we know it. This would have a major effect on the ability to homeschool. Now, I will say a lot of other states, including some, Republican-led states like Missouri, have far more restrictive requirements on homeschooling, and I believe homeschooling in those states are alive and well. But those groups are adamantly opposed to really any changes in the law. They have announced that Illinois is one of the freest states for homeschooling, and they want to keep it that way.
The bill missed a deadline. As Peter was talking about, bill deadlines have passed for legislation to go from one house to the other, but it's not. It's it's still active from what I'm hearing.
The sponsor did tell us that she has requested an extension. The bill was read into for a third reading, which means it could be potentially voted on after the break if the leadership grants her that extension. And then there are some other avenues as well, like shell bills, where it could get a new life. I think right now it's on shaky ground. I think the Democrats are even overwhelmed by the volume of calls and letters and emails and just the push from the homeschool activist to try to kill the bill. So I think that it will be really interesting to see what happens when we get back from spring break.
We'll definitely keep an eye on that. Peter, I want to move over to you. There's another reform issue that's moving through the legislature this spring, and that has to do with higher education funding reform. Legislation's been filed to change the way the state funds its state universities to put them on basically a more even playing field when it comes to the amount of state funding they get. The plan's modeled somewhat on the way that lawmakers voted a few years ago with that evidence-based funding model for K through 12 schools. Where do things stand now in both houses as you know it?
Yeah, so far the bill has not come up for discussion in either chamber or in committees of either chamber, but it is out there, and I am told that it would either get an extension or be put in a shell bill. This is one of those issues that's been kind of marinating in the Statehouse for a few years, and the advocates for it really think this is the year it could move. Like you said, it would put higher education on a funding formula similar to the evidence-based funding formula for K through 12 education, where essentially you would use a mathematical formula with all these different factors that would set an adequacy target for each university in the state. What would be an adequate level of funding? And then they're talking about, upwards of $1.5 to $2 billion in additional funding over the next 10 to 15 years that they would have to, kind of stair step up each year, just like they do with evidence-based funding, which is like $350 million of new money every year for K through 12. They would do the same thing for higher ed, only under this formula, you would know which universities were getting the money, what they were getting the money for, and why some universities were being picked above other universities. And so they really think that they now have a formula that they can sell to their colleagues, and they think they can get this through. It's been under negotiation for a long time. The tricky parts are the fine details of that formula, and because higher ed is very parochial. So if the formula says Northern Illinois is going to get less money than SIU Carbondale, or U of I is going to get less money than it would otherwise get under any other formula, then of course, people get very protective of that. So the details of the formula are going to be important. And then, of course, because we're in tight budget times, where is this $1.5 to $2 billion going to come from? Because right now the governor is saying that if you want to add money to the budget, you need to identify the places where you're taking it out of someplace else. So, in a tight budget year, this could be a hard sell.
Molly, I want to bring you in on this because you recently wrote an article about the impact of the last few decades of higher education funding affecting universities in particular, like Southern Illinois University. How would this be something that SIU Carbondale might be impacted by?
Well, I think our universities across the state are in precarious financial situations, save for perhaps the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, which has seen enrollment growth. Many of our universities have seen enrollment declines, growing deferred maintenance, which is a bit of a jargon word that means, our buildings are falling apart. They're not being repaired, despite that campuses have these beautiful buildings. They are in vast need of repair. And so I think that this is a tough situation on top of the federal cuts to higher education, the federal shakeup that's happening, to not know what our state budget situation might look like. I know it's going to be of high interest to the universities, including SIU, but across the state.
While I have you on the higher education topic, you've also written about the impact of how visas are being revoked for international students. How is this impacting universities in Illinois, as far as we know at this point?
I was trying to get a rough count. Some of the universities won't say how many students they have had impacted, but I believe at this point it is safe to say it's at least 75 and probably more and growing. And that's a ton of students. If we had 75 students removed from our campuses for any reason across the state without information as to why, I think we would all be up in arms. But I think because this is just happening so rapidly and people are lacking information about it, that groundswell of support or concern hasn't maybe fully materialized yet. But I think this is an issue to watch. And I think it's very concerning that we have students who have come here, made a contract basically with the university to study, and are finding out sometimes second and third hand that their visas have been revoked, as has their student status.
We're going to have to keep an eye on that. Ben, there was a recent decision by the Illinois State Supreme Court on how the state draws up its legislative districts, the boundary lines on that. Illinois Republicans had argued that Democrats did not draw up the district boundaries to take into account making them compact and contiguous. The court ruled against the Republicans. Why?
Yeah, the Illinois Republicans in the House, they waited for the last two election cycles to be able to gather data that they say proves that these claims are true, that the districts are gerrymandered. But the court said that's just simply too long. It's been nearly 4 years since the maps were drawn and the maps were passed. And the court said at this point, it's too late. They should have filed this challenge years ago. So we're really not going to get an answer on any sort of redistricting case here, just because the court said the Republicans simply waited too long to wait for 2 election cycles to pass.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting thing as you watch this over the years. Illinois is very interesting in the way that it does this. There's a commission sometime that's involved, and sometimes it's actually gone to the point where they did a drawing out of Abraham Lincoln's stovepipe hat to figure out who wrapped up actually wrote the district boundaries. Thanks to all for a great session here on Illinois Lawmakers. To Ben Szalinski, Peter Hancock, and Molly Stevens, Capital News Illinois and ProPublica. Thanks for your time and expertise. I'm Jak Tichenor. Join us next week for another edition of Illinois Lawmakers.